LD Comics is a women-led welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeten as Ladies Do Comics, today LD Comics is run by a committee of published graphic novelists: Rachel Ball, Emma Burley, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeten. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
I'm Anna Barron. I'm a political cartoonist and comics artist, and I draw a weekly political cartoon for The Guardian and also contribute regularly to The Times and Sunday Times. I'm currently working on my debut graphic novel, Interface, which is to be published by Virago in 2026. And this is a picture of me in the drawing office at the Sir John Soanes Museum, where I was recently the artist in residence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about political cartoons, specifically how you can tell a story or build an argument with only one panel. And then I'll talk about my graphic novel, and then I'm going to go a little bit more personal about my process and inspirations. So political cartoons tend to have only one panel because of the limits that you have with space in the paper and also time to draw it. You make an argument via the composition of the different visual metaphors on the page. And political cartoons rely on a shared frame of reference. That's what makes them so concise. They don't tell you the news. They provide visual cues to navigate your existing understanding of current affairs. So this is a cartoon I drew yesterday for today's Guardian on Israel's military offensive on Rafah. The argument is formed from different visual flows, the looming music, the decreasing number of seats that show they have nowhere else to go. So one of the ways that you can control how someone's eye reads a cartoon is based on the perspective from which it's drawn. The point of view from which a political cartoon is drawn can make you question your point of view in the real world. This cartoon recalls something that many of us have seen, the comedian Russell Brand on stage. However, with a subtle slip of the hand, it also evokes the allegations against him of sexual assault. It then flips the familiar image to shine a light not on the stage, but on the audience. That are recast as the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil monkeys. Thus, the point of view from which it's drawn, the perspective, forces us to consider the society that not only let Brand's blatantly sexist humour slide, but put him on a pedestal for it. It says, look, you were there in the audience and you laughed. What does that make you? I think one of the most interesting things that a cartoon can do with perspective is to show two simultaneously. Read horizontally, the top three panels here depict 3 New Year's resolutions in the life of the UK's multi-millionaire Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And then the bottom 3 panels depict those same resolutions in the lives of a single mother working for the public sector. Read vertically, the gap between the top and the bottom panels exposes social inequality, and the irony of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, correlating between the gap between those who make the rules and those who must live by them. This one also breaks down the gap between two perspectives that wouldn't normally touch, and in doing so tries to make them accountable to one another. I drew it recently for The Guardian on the social media coverage of the atrocities happening in Gaza and how we scroll past them. Given how much of politics is about drawing dividing lines, I think it's a very powerful tool to make people see two sides of an argument or a conflict. This cartoon was drawn for The Guardian on 8th October 2023, just after Hamas's attack on Israel, just before Israel's attack on Gaza began. It was an attempt to testify to the human sufferings on both sides, in my eyes, equally innocent, equally needless. But sometimes, even the attempt to be even-handed can be fraught. When this was published, people criticised the moral equivalence. How could I put murder, rape, and kidnap on an even playing field with the military acting in self-defence? Now, given the thousands more children that have been killed in Gaza than Israel, it could be criticised for quite a different reason, for a symmetry that has become numerically inaccurate and therefore politically charged, in a way that I never intended. Political cartoons capture a moment. they can go off like sour milk. I think this cartoon has perhaps aged better. It was drawn for The Guardian 3 weeks after the previous one, during a weekend in which London was filled with protest marches, both pro-Israel and pro-Gaza. Again, the symmetry of the composition attempts to show two perspectives, both sides of a political division. But it goes further to suggest that those divisions are born of pain and preconceptions. Healing can come from bridging the gap and from seeing the other side clearly as not that different from yourself. Given that I had only 4 hours to draw this, I drew one half and then digitally reflected it to make the other with some minor edits. In context, not a very politically correct technique, nor a very subtle one. The relationship between these two figures is strikingly neat, but also painfully reductive. Only very simple things are that perfectly symmetrical. Real life is far more messy and complicated, infinitely so. But imagine that if in all that infinite mess, you could zoom in on 2 windows in the same city, but at opposite ends of a spectrum of privilege, an elite skyscraper and the shadowy slums that cluster at its feet. Beyond these 2 windows are 2 very different rooms, in which sleep 2 very different children, Ren and Finnick. This is the opening of my graphic novel Interface. Set in a fictional city in a dystopian near future, it follows Ren and Finn in parallel, one drawn on the left-hand page and the other on the right. On every double spread, the reader can look across the composition of both pages to see that Ren and Finn's worlds are not so much parallel as interconnected, and even outputs for the same gender and class politics. In this, it borrows a lot from the political cartoon techniques that we looked at the start, arguments that are built not so much out of consecutive panels as from the composition of the entire image. As our protagonists grow, we see how many of the social privileges that benefit Finn as a Highlander are contingent on lowlanders like Ren being denied access. Similarly, Ren's experience of what it is to be a woman forms and is formed by Finn's experience of what it is to be a man. One night, quite by chance, their 2 parallel narratives converge. Finn is working late in the office and Ren that drops off his takeaway. The backgrounds align across the double spread, yet Ren and Finn remain trapped on their respective pages. Gradually, after many takeaways, ordered over many lonely nights, an awkward friendship develops. But when they touch, the central gutter bends around their clasped hands. It cannot break. Only their speech bubbles can bridge the gap, as it is the stories they share that lace the book and their life together. We experience their growing emotional connection visually. On this double spread, Ren and Finn both visit a shopping centre with a whale in the atrium roof, but they visit at different times and see the same thing from quite literal different perspectives. In the next double spread, I have the whale cutting through both their pages because they're now connected by the fact that they're thinking about the same thing. Finn and Ren struggle to understand each other is symptomatic of a polarised society where social media and delivery drones keep the privileged safe in their shiny bubbles. In a world that seems ever more divided, this is a vital story of how we can connect. It asks how clearly we see the people we meet in passing, the people we get to know, the people we love even. Do we really touch, like inside, here and here? Or are we all just trapped in our separate boxes? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where my graphic novel came from. And there are like 3 parts to this, like my inspiration for the concept, my desire to work on something long form, and how life made or let that happen. So for inspiration, we need to go on a bit of a journey to South Sudan via Beirut. At the beginning of my career, I did a lot of illustrations about sexual assault. And this wasn't really my choice. I was just one of very few female editorial cartoonists drawing for newspapers at a time when #MeToo stories dominated the headlines. And editors commissioned me on this, but not on other aspects of politics. It was quite annoying, really. Now, 5 years into my career, I've finally earned the right that my male colleagues started with to draw on the papers on anything. And I'm actually really proud of that Russell Brand cartoon I showed you at the start, because I wasn't commissioned to draw it because I'm a woman, but because I now draw The Guardian's lead political cartoon with such regularity that I just happened to be on shift when the Brand story broke. So because of these drawings on sexual assault, and also a project I did on student mental health for The Guardian whilst I was still at university, I started working with the medical aid charity Doctors Without Borders, otherwise known as Médecins Sans Frontières. I travelled to MSF's field hospital in Shatila refugee camp Beirut and spent several weeks interviewing their staff and patients. And then I produced a series of illustrations for The Guardian that combined their testimony with my illustrations, one of which you can see on the screen now. And here's another one. I'll just read you the quotations that inspired and accompanied it. So it was about a Syrian refugee, and she said, "A good memory of Syria. The night I finished my university exams, we all went to the public park to have a barbecue and chill. Look, I have photos, I can show you. I may have nothing here, but back home I was decent and respected. I had a job, a good home, neighbours, friends. It's hard to accept that life is gone." And then her counsellor said, "I remind her she is resilient. I say it will be like jumping into water. The cold of that new hostile environment shocks at first, but gradually you grow accustomed to the discomfort until it is easier to bear. Good memories sustain us when things are hard. I say to dedicate a specific time every day to remember the places and people you have lost, to think about them, to look at photos. But in order to make the most of the present, it is important to accept the reality that you cannot go back to the past." In this drawing, the photo album is meant to be like wings, helping the woman float, but also weighing her down. The hope was that these drawings would give people an emotive glimpse into the lives of the individuals that inspired them, and in doing so raise awareness and help fund MSF's vital work. And whilst I believe wholeheartedly in that, in the field I did have a minor existential crisis about my ability to do justice to their experiences. The lives of these Syrian refugees were so very different to mine. What ability, what right even, did I have to tell their story? To be true to someone in words, you can just transcribe what they say verbatim, but there are no quotation marks in drawings. To reformulate someone's words into an entirely different medium, their story must go into and through you. Bits of it get stuck to it, bits of you get stuck to it, and bits of them will stay with you. In later commissions for Doctors Without Borders, I took this acute awareness of the imperfections of my work and tried to manifest it visually. If my work was openly inauthentic insofar as it did not hide the cracks, but highlighted them, might it also be more honest, more true? These are some of the field sketches I drew in Peebles, South Sudan on another commission for MSF. The end result was a comic which focused on the family, Chacha and her pregnant daughter Laito, and the incredible journey that they had to undertake in order to reach the maternity hospital. Generations of conflict have left South Sudan littered with abandoned artillery vehicles. The comic page I drew on the left shows one such vehicle, which Chacha and Laito saw on their journey. But this isn't my experience. I never saw this. I drew it based on their description. So in the little panels below, I've drawn them telling me the story and me sketching it. And we have this like little cross the panels from their story of their journey into my experience. The page on the right works similarly. Laito and Chacha's experience of crossing a crocodile-filled river on a tarpaulin, supported and undercut by the little panels that are the story of them telling me their story. So all these ideas about trying to bridge different perspectives, my struggle to understand people whose life were different to mine, my desire to represent them, and also the anxiety that went with that. These were the conceptual seeds in my graphic novel Interface, which is at its heart just about two very different people and their struggle to connect. Most of the other themes from Interface are drawn from my work as a political cartoonist. Not so much the focus in my daily cartoons, because they're often short-sighted, so much as the overarching themes that weave them together: social inequality, technology, the environment, mental health, loneliness. Because political cartoons work ahead of the curve, we think a lot about how news stories develop, how events will unfold tomorrow. So with Interface, I've taken these topical themes and tried to extrapolate them, not to tomorrow, but to a futuristic dystopia that is a satire of today. To ensure that a political cartoon is topical, we have to work so quickly, less than 5 hours from pitching to completing the final artwork. This deadline pressure has really forced me to have confidence in my own style. I used to draw in shapes and shape them down until they felt right, and now I find I draw more in lines because it's quicker and I just know where the right edge is. I always make a newspaper deadline by the skin of my teeth, barely able to see the wood for the trees. There's no time to make a cup of tea, pat the dog, go for a walk around the block, before you notice, for example, that Prince Harry has an extra limb. By the time you've done this, the cartoon is no longer only on your desk, but being printed hundreds of thousands of times and already up on the newspaper's website. And someone has already commented below the line asking why you bother getting out of bed in the morning, a comment that has been liked by 93, 94, 95 people. And all you have for protection is an email receipt from your editor that reads THKX, because he really is far too busy to give you vowels or notice that Prince Harry has an extra leg. But it's okay, you're okay. because there's always tomorrow. Tomorrow, well, I guess it's today now. You get another shot. Because after all that desperate stress of getting a thing done in time, it ends up in the recycling bin with the ink barely dry. Maybe you succeeded in capturing a moment, but only for a moment before the news careers away, leaving your snapshot obsolete. This cartoon I showed you at the beginning that I drew yesterday for today's Guardian is, as we speak, being thrown away all around the country thousands of times. And so it should be. It's out of date. The military offensive is no longer looming. It has begun. One of the most terrifying and stimulating things about drawing political cartoons is that you're working with live material. You're not like documenting the news, but also helping to define and shape it. But if it's live, it means it's real living people's lives. It's not your story, it's not fiction, it's not history, it's not academic, it's real. Real people have a right to reply. The recent crisis in Gaza has brought this acutely into focus for me. However hard I try to be balanced, it's impossible with this one not to offend someone. And honest to God, I am terrified. Terrified that a news story will break halfway through my shift and I won't know what to do with it. Or that I'll know what to say but fail to draw it in the time available. Or that the news will twist away between pitch and publication and what I've drawn will land wrong and no one will care that that's not what I meant because I still signed to the bottom of it. This fear became a lot less academic last Monday, when this cartoon I drew for The Guardian about the Ayatollah of Iran's foreign policy proved somewhat controversial on Twitter. Within hours, it had racked up over 300,000 views, flooding my inbox with people and bots telling me to rot in hell for being both an anti-Semitic Nazi and an Islamophobic Jew. I am working on my thick skin, but not too thick, because after all, we artists are emotional creatures, and how can I draw about something that I don't care about? The pace of keeping up with the news with political cartoons often leads to work that is painfully short-sighted, lacking in nuance. There's no time, no space for more than one dimension. Each deadline feels like running at a wall again and again and again in the same flipping way. Writing this graphic novel has been like, let's take a step, pause, take a breath, maybe build a ladder. And people might not like my graphic novel, but I don't think they'll hate me for it. They certainly won't want to kill me for it. And that's because it's not drawn from their lives, but from mine. So just to end, I thought I'd just very briefly tell you a bit about my life and how this book came out of it. Literature at Oxford University, and I started drawing cartoons for the student papers just because the weekly deadline meant that I knew I'd make some time for my art. This is one of the drawings I did on student mental health for The Guardian, which I mentioned earlier with the beginning of my work with MSF. So after uni, I decided to take a gap year just to do some drawing, very much with the intention of doing a law conversion after. And well, 1 year turned into 2 and then into 3. And the truth is I got very lucky. Straight out of uni, I cold emailed lots of newspapers trying to find work as a cartoonist. And quite by chance, my email landed in the inbox of the new editor of the Times Literary Supplement. Just as it happened that they were looking for a new cartoonist and I got the job. And I started doing a weekly cartoon or cover for them, often something topical with a literary twist. Off the back of it, lots of other illustrations came too, and it was just enough to scrape by. Until the pandemic hit, and I lost all my clients and then the TLS cut my page. In 3 years of working full-time for them, and I got no notice or severance pay. Financially, it was a sticky patch. I'd been scraping by 4 years, and there was no back pocket, nothing left to scrape. I couldn't get any work as a cartoonist. I couldn't even get work in a bar. It was lockdown. I wound up working as a caretaker in an empty office block on Liverpool Street, looking after the building whilst its normal inhabitants worked from home. It was dark and cold and left ample space to reflect on the fact that life really hadn't turned out at all how I'd been expecting it. And the worst thing was I felt like I had myself to blame. All of my uni friends had good corporate jobs that had sort of seen them safely through the pandemic. I had not, and now I had no career, no money, and long COVID to boot. People were dying, the economy was shot, I hadn't seen my family in months, and well, dark days, inside and out. And there was really only one thing I had left, one thing that I could still do, one thing that always without exception made me feel better, and that was drawing. Long before I thought anyone else would read it, I drew this book for myself. The quiet of lockdown gave me the headspace to work out what I wanted to say, before I had to explain it to anyone else. And then the world kept turning and we pulled through the pandemic and I started getting political cartoon work again and I got an agent and then a publishing deal with Virago and funding from the Arts Council and the Society of Authors, the London Library, the Sir John Soanes Museum, and we are scraping by. If I had known how long this book would take me, how many thousands of pounds I'd have to raise in order to support my livelihood was working on it, I would have written something significantly shorter or perhaps not started at all. But I've now sketched 334 pages of interface and completed the final artwork for 108. I can draw a double spread a week if I have nothing else on, which I always do. But I'm not really in a hurry. My political cartoons are spat out in such a painful rush. This book, I just want to time to get it right. I wanted to end with this drawing on the screen. It's a bit from the book, but I think it links back to a lot of what I said at the start about non-linear narratives, because as well as reading right to left, the composition pulls you along with the flow of the music. And you might notice some parallels between this and the Rafa cartoon that I drew for today's Guardian, which makes sense given that I was working on them back to back. In this page, Ren is high on LSD, and she's having like a synesthetic reaction to the music. Comics are, I think, inherently synesthetic because we only have visuals to represent sound, touch, taste, and smell. And I think there's something really interesting to play with. And well, I love this page because I've just finished it, and I always love the thing that I've just finished. But everything I've said in this talk about my work, trying to bridge different perspectives, trying to communicate, trying to connect, I have often visual auditory synesthesia, and I think this drawing communicates my experience. And well, now you can see it too. You can see my perspective, and that's connection. And that's the reason why I draw things. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to take your questions.
My name is Chelwek. I'm a graffiti artist and illustrator based in Nairobi. And yeah, I can't wait to share my work with you and talk more about my art. Cool. So my interest in art started when I was a kid, and I went to the university to study design, where I wanted to do kids' book illustration. But I felt that the teachers were not giving me what I wanted. So one time when I was going to school, I was walking to school, I saw some graffiti randomly pop up that was not there yesterday. So I followed the steps, which had like vultures, that led to a bigger mural. And around that time, we had a revolution, and it was called the Unga Revolution, where they did them a vulture graffiti just to call out the politicians for mismanaging resources and destroying our economy at that time. And so at that moment, I had like a last moment, like, this is what I want to do. I want to do murals because it will not be enclosed in spaces. It will be out in the public for everyone to see. And yeah, so that's how I got into murals. And in this slide, you'll see one of my favorite murals that I did. And it was unfortunately a temporary mural, but I still love it to date. Yeah, so I got to travel a lot because of murals, and I've got to meet different characters, and through this I've got to learn more things that led me to be a storyteller, because sometimes you do one image but you don't know how to explain it to people. And so I try to include so many elements in my murals to tell stories, to invoke people to ask questions and stop and just have their own idea of what the mural is about. Yeah, so around that time, again, I started going back to digital medium because after school, you're trying to do murals, and you really can't get a job doing mural full-time. You can't live off murals full-time back then. And so there was an incubation program where they were teaching us how to do creative things. So we were taught how to do music production, illustration, and a bit of animation. And that's the time I got to buy my first tablet, which was at that time it was expensive, and for like 2 weeks I didn't open the box because I felt like this thing has drained my account. And but then a friend told me, no, but this is what you wanted to do. So I opened the box and I did my first YouTube tutorial on the digital painting, which I was excited about, and I posted on Instagram with all excitement. And since then, I got to do more illustrations, and this is on the screen is two of my favorite illustrations. The first one is called Yath, And so in my illustrations, I try to show the feminine power and African spiritualism, because most of my characters usually have masks in them and some symbolism in form of animals, plants, and words. Sorry. Yeah, for instance, the first image is called Yath. And there's a Swahili saying that akili ni nywele kila mtu ana zake, so it means like everyone has hair, and it's just like knowledge, like everyone has knowledge inside of them. So the first illustration is called Yath, and I chose to use gray hair to show the you know how when people get old they have gray hair, and it also symbolizes like wisdom that comes with age. So Yath means a medicine person, like a person full of knowledge, and she symbolizes nature and how it has come over time. It has changed with us, but it's still growing and alive. And the chameleon represents change, and the bird represents like future and hope. And also the flowers represent continuity, because without flowers we cannot have seed and we cannot have continuity. And the second illustration is called Namdwe, which just gives awe to the things that we do not know but are bigger than us. That's why I used the whales in the background to show the vastness of what we don't know, the vastness of the universe, and just us being in respect of this knowledge that is freely given to us. Yes. Cool. So I got to do a comic last year, and I can say it's my first comic book, because I used to do just one illustration and do like a story below the illustration. And yeah, so there was a call out last year for feminists to tell stories of feminism and stories of change in their country. And I did my application, and my proposal went through, and so I got to write the story, which is called The Last Stand. And in the image, you can see there's a little girl sitting by the park reading a book. And in the background, there's an illustration of the city of Nairobi and a rock at the corner written Freedom Corner. So Freedom Corner is a place in a park. We have a park in the city which is called Uhuru Park, and Uhuru Park translates to freedom in English. And Uhuru Park has a history of political marches, and it's a symbol for change in most of our political history, because most people met there to start riots, not to start riots, to march for change and call out for democracy and freedom. So this book Freedom Corner revolves around Uhuru Park. And it just shows the new generation who are trying to read the story of Freedom Corner at Uhuru Park, which is now unfortunately closed off to the public. But for the longest time, it was a place where activists united to rally for change. A link to the comic book was shared, so you can get to see clearer images of the comic book. But I divided my book into 3 sections just to show that feminism and the influence of politics in our daily lives did not start now, but it started way before, during the time of colonization. And in this image, there's a female warrior, and her name was Muthoni Wakirima, and she was the only female field marshal who fought for independence in Kenya. And she was very feared as a strong warrior and as a good strategist. And she, together with a couple of other warriors, managed to get us independence. And she made a decision not to shave her locks until Kenya was truly free. Yes, we got freedom from the colonizers, but we were not free from our political leaders, who were very dictatorial, and we did not have much freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and then we were ruled by a one-party state. So it was very one-directional, and so she believed that we did not gain freedom then. So fast forward to the post-colonial period, where one of the Kenya's former president arrested people illegally and put them in torture chambers, which is famously known as Nyayo House. And the mothers of these political prisoners used to come to Uhuru Park to ask for the release of their sons, and they always met with violence. They were met with violence, and their message, to go through. But the students from the University of Nairobi saw this, and they came in to try and offer support to the mothers. And also there was Wangari Maathai, who started the Green Belt movement, who also came in to help the mothers, but they were beaten that same day, and Wangari Maathai went into a coma. And so they saw that their efforts were not gaining the results they wanted. So they decided to change the strategy of how they were fighting the battle against the government. So in our society, it's a taboo to see the nakedness of an elderly person. So the mothers decided to meet at the park and to strip naked. So when the police came to beat them, they could not look at them. They could not even touch them. So they were afraid. And this made the government shocked, and they listened. So with this, it made people more courageous to come and fight the government, because they saw that it's possible to fight, and you don't need like weapons or strong tools. All you need is you and your body and your strength and your willingness to fight for what is right. And there was a group of lawyers who came together, and Wangari Maathai is another, not Wangari Maathai, Mother Karua, sorry. Mother Karua is one of the female lawyers who fought against the dictator, who was very much feared back then. And she was one of the women who brought the case to court and was calling for democracy and calling for the release of these prisoners. And with the mothers stripping at the park, and the lawyer in court, the judges decided to release the prisoners, and all the political prisoners were set free thanks to the mothers and this brave women and lawyers who fought for them. And so this was the second part of the comic book, which was based on the post-colonial period where we were free, but not so free. So during this time is when we saw the break of the one-party state, and now we became a multi-party state where we could oppose the government. We could speak up, and people could listen. And so this was all thanks to the women who came together to fight and who stood for what was right. So I broke the comic book into 3 parts. Now the last part is based on the last 10 years, which I am a part of. And it shows the present time, and we have been facing a lot of femicide cases in the last 10 years, and there's been around the Me Too movement, those stories around also in Kenya where women were being stripped when they walked in town because of how they were dressing. And yeah, so I tried to show this story. I tried to show the present time in my comic book, because I also went through some of the abuses that women go through in public transport, and I wanted to show that it doesn't only happen to one person, it happens and it's rampant, and it's just that people are afraid to share their stories. And if we share their story, if we come as a collective and share our stories and do something about it, change can happen. So this page is based off of our transport system, and it's you can see there's a tout standing outside the bus. We call them matatus, and they're usually heavily graffiti. They have a lot of art, which I really love, because I think we're the only country that has a lot of graffiti and art in the public transport vehicles. And so the lady was trying to get into the matatu, but she gets harassed by the tout and the people did not support her. They were accusing her for asking for it because of what she was wearing. And this happens a lot, that women get blamed for what happens to them. And so I tried to show this on this page, on the last part of this comic book. And yeah, and it was just like a call to action to speak out more and come together. And so in this present day, a lot of women came together, and we did a march, which was called a Total Shutdown KE. We, after the increase in the femicide cases in Kenya, and it actually got the government to change some rules, and it started a movement called He for She campaign, where it called on men to protect the women and to speak out more to end gender-based violence and sexual harassment in public and also in private spaces. And with that, we saw a rise in many feminist movements in the past 10 years. For instance, there's the Feminist in Kenya movement and other organizations, other NGOs that support women who have undergone this violent traumas and attacks, and they've also created safe houses for victims. And it's not only they not only support women, but they also support elderly and the children, which has been like a very inclusive movement that started out of a feminist movement. Yeah, so the reason I wrote this book was to just show the struggles that we have, and that it's not individual, but it's collective. And it's called The Last Stand because now Uhuru Park is closed off, but that does not mean that we stop fighting for what is right, for what's true. But now the last stand is our bodies, because we fight from where we are, we fight with our minds, with our hearts. And yeah, and this shows that the last stand is with us, it's not at Uhuru Park. Yeah, that's it for the graphic novel. And for future project, I got to do a workshop where we did animation. And since I went to study illustration to do kids' book illustrations, which I put aside because of doing graffiti. Now I got to do this workshop, and I would love to get back and tell more kids stories. And Donji Donji was one example we did with a group of friends, where we told the story of these two characters who went to a magical land to learn about carrots and their benefits. Yeah, so I'd love to tell stories for kids, and also try to break down these hard topics, for instance, feminism, and explain it better to kids, to children, in a more child-friendly manner. I also got into augmented reality, where I would love to, for kids who cannot read, we can have the book, we can have like a voice reading the story to the children. And those are the two things I want to do mostly for my future projects. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I'm open to any questions, and I'll be happy to answer.
My name's Yomi Ayeni. I am based in London. I'm an author, producer. I organize events, I DJ, and I'm a storyteller first and foremost. First, huge respect to to the two previous speakers. Totally blown by their experience, how it has been illustrated and demonstrated, and the activism and the slight, not overtly political edge that they add to their work, which I'm sure makes it a lot more easier to access, as opposed to being totally and utterly confrontational. And the reason for saying this is you'll understand from my background. A few things about me. Well, I started, my first love was as a DJ. I started working on radio, state radio, when I was about 14, 15, and I have had a radio show for almost all of my life in different countries, in Africa, US, and here in the UK. First love, when I was at college or at school, I got into radio, and over in the UK, we have pirate radio. And having been starved of good music for most of my life, at that point, I decided that I needed to do something about it. So I joined the Rebels, and we were playing music from basements and council blocks around London, and we believed in our hearts that we were providing a service that conventional and traditional radio didn't provide, which was we were playing funk, soul, disco, which you would never get on Radio 1 or any of the other outlets. And that was one of the things that actually got my mind focused on what I wanted to do with my life. I finished college, and I got my first job. This is where things started going slightly weird. I got my first job, which was working for the BBC. These are all the outlets that I worked for over that period, which made me highly politicized and political. But at the same time, I realized that there was a colossal amount of injustice, and I did not appreciate the people who were setting the news agenda of the day. I saw things that made my stomach turn. And when I approached a news organizer about them, I was told that they do that every day, so that's not news. I mean, we're talking about things like stoning, women's being stoned in Iran. I sat through the Rwanda conflict, where I saw stories where you had rivers of blood, actual rivers of blood, or come in just before the news bulletin, and that story had to be dropped because it was just too much we felt it was too much to actually feed to the public. Sat through various elections where I saw the underhanded and double standard of politicians, which just made me think, I think the best thing I got out of it was a journalist over here called Jeremy Paxman, who once said, each time a politician sits in front of him for a question, the first thing that comes to his mind is, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And he said, once he's taken that approach, no matter what the politician says, it doesn't cut. So I adopted that as a way of moving forward. While working at the BBC, I ran a record label. Still, that musical thing was with me. I felt still record companies, the big studios, the big multinational agencies were not giving the sort of music I wanted to hear airplay, and it was almost impossible for people like myself to break into the music scene. So I created my own record label. Subsequently released 40 odd records at the time, and I was instrumental in a genre that they call drum and bass. In fact, my record was one of the first to actually do that, and I kind of felt it was a music of young London. It was something that we felt, the energy that we had needed to be expressed somehow. And then from that, I jumped into reality television. And this is when I get to tell you about the books that I've written, then you'll understand how all of these things thread together. I still felt we were not getting the representation that we wanted. So I created several reality television programs, won a few awards, fell in love with the medium again, only to be told after winning an award that I needed to create a format for a show that we actually beat in our category. I went in and I was told, now we want you to create a Big Brother. And I said, we won the category of a Big Brother. They said, yes, we understand that, but we want you to go away and create our own Big Brother. And this was for ITV. At that point, I walked out of media altogether, and I abandoned the industry for a while. Until I looked at society. I looked at what was happening to me. I looked at what was happening in society. I looked at all these various other things going on, and I felt there was still this disconnect. There was a colossal amount of distrust between the Black community and the police. There was racial tension all over the place, and the media wasn't helping in any way. So I created my first film, which was a story about young people finding the best way to enjoy themselves, where certain incidents, people were being found dead, but they didn't trust the police enough to pass that information on. And I created it as an immersive piece so society could see where the disconnect was. I created these immersive installations and in sort of experiences where people could live within the story for a particular period, and they had telephone numbers of the actors who were actually playing the police that they could call. None of them did. Everybody wanted to join the fraternity to have a good time, and no one wanted to pass the information over to the police. So it became a bit of a weird whodunit. And that in itself reaffirmed my understanding that society and authority will hardly ever get on as long as the status quo remains. After doing that, I realized also that I was stuck on technology, because technology at that point was a bit of a barrier. And I remember I think it was William Gibson in America who's written quite a lot, a science fiction writer, said he saw the LA riots and saw people breaking into shops and stealing televisions and stealing stereos and trampling all over computers. And he wondered, he said, don't these people realize that that computer could be the very thing that gets them out of that mental ghetto that they have? And I thought, there has to be a way of addressing the past in a way that isn't confrontational to anyone, but gives people the opportunity to actually engage with the colonial history of my people, of my race, to actually understand what was wrong and hopefully address the future. So I came onto my first project called Clockwork Watch, which was also written as an immersive story. I wanted people to relive that colonial experience. Unfortunately, no one was going to give me money to do it. So I bumped into a friend who kind of suggested, why don't you do it as a comic? I said, well, I'm a broadcast journalist. I'm a producer, director of film. Why do I want to go and do comics? I said, you can get away with a lot more with comics. And he asked me why I wanted to tell this story. I said, when I was growing up, there were signs on pubs. I mean, as a kid, I walked around South London. There were signs on pub doors saying no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. So I decided to create a story called Clockwork Watch, which, to all intents and purposes, was this harmonious, immersive world. But what I did was I created an automaton, a clockwork race, who did all the cleaning, all the manual work, everything. They were just almost zombied, in semi-intelligent automatons who did everything that you wanted them to do in society. And then you had this harmonious society to one side. And what I did with that is I put the abolition of the slave trade, the suffragette movement, the civil rights movement, and all of the ills of the past, I heaped it on the automatons. And I gave the public an opportunity to interact with those ills, not just in the books, but in the immersive theatre pieces that we have been creating for the past 12 years. And over that particular period, and this is weird, this is a self-published book, series of books. We only said we were going to do 3. Anyway, with the live events, and you would expect some part of society to shy away from this thing that is shining a light on colonialism, on slave trade, on tariffs, on the exploitation of various parts of the world. Well, I have worked, we had a 1-year installation at the Royal Observatory. I had an immersive experience, one of the very few, in the Queen's House in Greenwich. We've worked with the British Library, Scottsdale, Arizona Library in America, Latitude Festival. I mean, the list goes on. At least 10 to 12 immersive events where we've been able to give people an opportunity to step into that world and to explore things that would really jar with them. The story itself, how did I do it? Or how did we come about this? Well, the first thing I did was, being Black, I have my own idiosyncrasies and my understanding of the slave trade. I read extensively. I even studied African history. But I also know that the Sikh nation in India have done a lot for this country. Winston Churchill even stood up in the House of Commons and said, if not for the Sikh nation, there wouldn't be a Great Britain. So I started my story from India, and I had a Sikh and a family who came over to the UK, not as economic migrants, but the father was a kinetic engineer who put a program, a cell, a battery into the heart of these automatons that gave them life. So they arrive And when you look at the Victorian age in England, I mean, it is steampunk, by the way. When you look at the Victorian age, and almost every sort of illustration or book or film that you see of that particular period, everything's dark and grey. And I decided, no, that's not the story I want to tell. I want to bring a family over from India, and from India, they'll have bright colors, they'll have gold, they'll have all of these amazing ornaments. So they arrive in the UK and they start to explore. And that story is quite deep in the understanding. And some of it's actually part of my own background, because I went to a boarding school, and the 8-year-old son, who's the main protagonist in the story, goes to a boarding school, and he charts some of the experiences I've had all through my life. But that was just one part of this narrative. There was another part, which was the actual slave aspect. And that related mainly to the automatons. So one of the things I wanted to do there, or I set out to do there, is to explain the plight of the automatons. All they really wanted to do within this story is to be accepted as equal, which I guess is what everybody wants in life. But because they're automatons, they're not accepted. Also, the sheer fact that within their world, they believe the next evolutionary leap for them is to be accepted as humans. So you have this conflict. And within the story, I kind of posed a couple of questions. The automaton says, well, what happens when there's darkness? And the man says, what do you mean about darkness? He said, well, there's darkness when you die, isn't it? And the guy said, well, I guess so. So does that mean when there's darkness, I am dead? And it poses a rather ethical sort of question with regards to giving people rights and understanding their rights, and actually giving them the allowance to be and to explore their own entity, their own experiences. So what I did with the story in itself is to actually separate each one of these things into respective silos. So you have the family who arrive from India, you have the automaton who wants to gain a sentience, or who gains a sentience within the story and wants to be accepted as human. And then you've got the third part, which is a man who is born out of wedlock, which is more or less, when you look at various people that were born out of wedlock within the slave period, be it master decides to rape or whatever. So you have that element. And this person who was born out of wedlock is more or less given the keys, because he's brought up by a scientist, more or less given the keys to actually determine the fate and the future of the country. And all of these elements have been played out in live events over the past 10 years. These are some of the pictures of some of the people who come to our gigs, and they all dress up. And I mean, I got into this to a certain degree when I hosted a party, and we had about 1,000 people there. I'm used to having big parties. But what I was surprised about was I was one of the few Black people at the gig. And I asked my friends, I said, why didn't you come to my gig? I said, hey, we're not coming out to dress up like colonialists. We're not coming to do this. So I thought, hold on, let me turn this thing on its head, which led to me creating Clockwork Watch. Initially, I set out to write 3 books. But as I delved deeper into the story, I realized it was going to take a lot longer. So far, I have written and self-published 11, which have won awards, goes to San Diego Comic-Con every year. It's given me trusteeship of various organizations based on my understanding of the narrative and how I have explained and have presented it. But then still, that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to redress some of the ill that has been heaped on nations around the world, because the legacy of colonialism still exists, whether you like it or not. And steampunk, the narrative or the genre that I was dealing with, tends, for some stupid reason, it seems some people think it represents that particular period, and people want to go around celebrating the colonial age, which is not the case. So a colleague, Dr. Jeff, and myself got together, and we spent 3 years talking about this. And we said, what we're going to do is we're going to create, around the Black Lives Matter period, we have the cog, which represents the industrial age that steampunk is set in. But you also have the Black Power salute. And we said, we are going to put that in the cog and make sure that we spread it all around the world at conventions to say, we love steampunk, but we hate colonialism, and take all the funds from that and support a school in Kenya that takes in underage girls and women and saves them from underage marriage and FGM. And we've been doing that for the past 3 years. So for once in my life, I kind of realized that I'm actually writing something and creating something that is not particularly for me. It is actually doing good somewhere else in the world. And I've had so many messages from these girls in Kenya, which I can't share, solely because this isn't about me, it is about them. But no one wants to know. I don't think it's right for me to share their gratitude or their plight, other than people buy a badge, wear it with pride, give us your money, let us do some good. So that is what Clockwork has been doing for the past number of years. Also, where am I now? Well, I'm still writing. We've got some more books to go with Clockwork. I've got a film that's doing the rounds at the moment, which I co-founded with a friend, that looks at gender politics and the slight abuse of women by men, and the sheer fact that people don't seem to pay much attention to the plight. I've got Breathe, which is the second part of the film that I have to do, where we actually look, in that instance, we look at technology and how you can use technology to gaslight or brainwash. And the third, Operation Noyad, which is based on part of my experience when I was at school, when there were tons of people, more than 3 million were jobless. You couldn't find housing. And it's a story about how the government decides to make half of London impotent, so that over time they'll die and they'll be able to sell the land to a Japanese hedge fund. These are all inspired by things that I have experienced working in a newsroom. That's how you can find me. My name's Yomi Ayeni. Thank you.